Good morning, friends. If we've not had the chance to meet, my name is Ben, and I serve as one of our pastors here at Hope Chapel, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to be here with you this morning. And I look forward to celebrating Easter alongside you next week through a couple of different things we've got coming around. You know that we have a Good Friday gathering on Friday night, and then our Easter Sunday gatherings with the Egg Factory and all those things that are happening here in Olathe next Sunday. And so I know you've been extending invitations to your friends and coworkers and neighbors and family members, and I've been praying for your invitations because I really believe that life change is one invitation away. And so as you continue to invite this week, just know I'll be praying with you and for you. Others of our staff will be praying with you and for you as we seek to bring the hope of Jesus into our world. Well, today I have the privilege of continuing on as we walk together through the Old Testament book of Judges. Now, if you're new on this journey, I just kind of want to give you the picture of where we've been over the last, since the beginning of this year. What we've been doing on Sunday mornings, every single Sunday stands on its own, and so you don't have to worry like you're coming into a movie that's halfway over, like you're good, all right? But over the course of the year, what we're doing is we're walking through the major narrative themes of the Bible to help us see and understand the story that we are a part of. And we started in Genesis, and we're just kind of making our way through it, and we're picking up a little bit of speed as we go through. Many of us have been reading through the Bible together in a year, and I hope that you've continued on in that. And if not, just pick it up, man. Don't worry about whether you've fallen behind or any of those things. Just pick it up, and let's continue to read the scriptures together. So several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to stand right here and talk about Abraham with you from Genesis, and the covenant, as we talked at that point, the covenant that God established with Abraham, that really sets the table for the establishment of the nation of Israel, that really sets the table and is in many ways the umbrella for which we understand the work of God in our world. And here's how we summarize the Abrahamic covenant together. We said that God is creating a people who are blessedly distinct from all so that they can be a distinct blessing to all, right? When God looked down upon the landscape of humanity and sought to bring about redemption and wholeness and renewal and flourishing from the brokenness that is in our world, the brokenness that is there because of sin, this is what he wanted. When God delivered the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt into the promised land, which is the land of Canaan, through Joshua, this is what he wanted. He wanted a people who were distinct from the people of Canaan. Not simply for their own posterity, but because he wanted the world to know. He wanted the whole world to know that he, the one true God of heaven and earth, the true God of Israel, was completely different than the gods of Canaan. And so as we go through Judges together, here's what we need to understand. Judges isn't the story of a faithful people, it's the story of a broken people. It's the story of what happens when people don't follow the Lord, when they choose their own ways over his ways, when they set aside his directions in favor of their own desires. It's a tragic tale. It's not a tale of how to live a good and moral and God-honoring life. In so many ways, the point of Judges is to show us how not to live, right? And so if when you're reading through Judges, you have this kind of like, you're supposed to feel that way, all right? That's not you going like, oh, maybe I'm at odds with like that. No, that's actually, you're supposed to kind of feel this like, oh, because Judges is the story of what happens when the people of God try to be like the people of Canaan. Or if we're doing it in our day, Judges is, analogous to when Christians try to live by the same sets of virtues and values as the world around them. Because from the very beginning, the desire of God has always, always, always been that his people were distinct from the culture in which they found themselves. Distinct. Not because of our purpose is to be adversarial to the culture that we find ourselves in, but because we're trying to be a light to the world. Friends, this is why oftentimes on our platforms, whether it's here in Olathe or in any of our other locations, you're not gonna hear us, harping on and on about how dark the darkness of our world is. It's not that we don't believe that our world has darkness in it. We see that, you see that, we all know that our world has darkness in it. But rather our desire has been over and again to light a candle, to point again and again and again to how beautiful the light of Jesus is. And so we're just gonna keep doing that together. So here's what we see in Judges. When the people enter Canaan, the promised land, they're told to create distinctness, to create separation between themselves and the residents of Canaan. But they don't do it, right? They don't clear out the space, and instead they choose to intermingle in the space. And rather than being distinct, they actually become undiscernible. Here's what the text says in Judges 2. It says, after that, a whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. Another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel, which means they hadn't even been told about the Lord, right? It says, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and that had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And then in Judges 3, it says, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. And this is the umbrella for the entire book of Judges. As you read through it, the people who were called to be judges actually move from being like pretty good to like, okay, which is Gideon, to like bad, and then to worse, and then to like, oh man. You get to the end of the book of Judges and you just kind of like pull your hair out and you're just like, what in the world is going on? And the message is not, yeah, this is a good thing, like follow this, right? The message is humanity. Israel needs a savior. Israel needs a leader who will be faithful to God in all things, no matter what, for all of time. And it's not happening in their own strength. And the entire structure of Judges is a cycle. Pastor Sarah talked about this last week, right? It's this sin cycle. And so the first part of the cycle is suffering. And so Israel, over again, we see it in Judges, Israel's oppressed by their enemies. And then there's repentance. The people cry out to God for forgiveness. And then there's deliverance, that God raises up a deliverer for them. And then there's this season of peace where the people return to peace. And then, the whole thing happens over again. And the entire book is this cycle of pain and suffering and destruction that just repeats itself over and over and over again. And just when you think that there's a leader who will finally lead Israel into this bright new tomorrow, the whole thing just repeats itself. And here's the thing about cycles of sin. They're actually never cycles. They're always and ever spirals. And that's not just Israel, that's you and I too. When we get into a cycle of sin, we never just hang out at the same level and go here. Sin destroys. It destructs, it devolves humanity. And so if you started at this level of health and flourishing, the longer you engage in the cycle of sin, the further down you spiral, and you do it long enough, you begin to spiral out of control. With all of that in mind, as the context, I want to talk about our next judge, Gideon. So remember, in this period of Israel's history, judges were spiritual, civic, military leaders. They weren't kings with ultimate authority, but they were the recognized leaders of the people. And so if you have your Bible with you, we're going to be in Judges 6, 7, and 8 today. And here it is in Judges 6, starting verse 1, it says this. It says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites because the power of Midian was so oppressive. The Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Now obviously things aren't going well for the Israelites as we pick up the text here, but tucked in here is this little nugget that I think helps us to just see just how far the people of Israel have wandered from the Lord in their sin. They were being overpowered, oppressed, right? Stolen from at every turn. They couldn't hardly eke out a living in this land of theirs. The land that God had given them. And yet, how long did it take for them to cry out to the Lord for help? 7 years. Now, I don't know where you were 7 years ago, but if you just stop and think about it for a moment, you're like, 7 years was a long time. And so for 7 years, they're just pillaged and robbed and oppressed and pushed down and pushed back. For 7 years, it happens day after day and harvest after harvest for 7 years. And it took 7 years for them to be like, wait, we're in this place because God has brought us to this place. Maybe we should cry out to our God for help. And as the cycle predicts, when they cry out to God for help, God sends them a deliverer. Verse 11, it says, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. So where do we find our hero? Where do we find our next new deliverer? Certainly he will be like on the precipice, on the rock, saying, guys, we can do it. We can stand up. Like God is on our side. We can go forward in faith because God has given this to us, right? No. Our mighty hero is hiding in a wine press, doing something that a wine press isn't even created for. Threshing his wheat. It's hardly the picture of a mighty warrior. And yet that's exactly how God sees him, and which is, I think, a reminder of an incredible truth. If you're a note taker, you might want to write this down. Because when it comes to God, it's not always about what you see. When it comes to God, it's not always about what you see. We meet Gideon hiding in the bottom of a wine press, hoping that with all that he had, that nobody would notice he's there, and hardly the picture of a mighty warrior, and that's how God sees him. And so friends, I just have to ask this question. What if God sees you differently than you see you? What if God sees you as more capable than you ever dreamed possible? What if all the people that told you that you couldn't, that you're not, and that you won't? What if the real limitation wasn't your potential, but it was their vision to see? Verse 13, it continues on. Gideon replies, it says, pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, I'm not really sure, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us. So not if, he's gone, but now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian. What is Gideon's protest? He says, God, if you are with us, which I'm pretty sure you're not, too little, too late. Maybe at one point in time, some time ago, there was like a sliver of hope. But now it's game over. It's lights out. It's your fault, actually. Verse 16, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength that you have. He didn't even answer his protest. He said, go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? See, Gideon brings forward this protest and this response, and God's reply to it is like, well, just go in the strength that you have. I know you don't believe it, but I've already given you everything that you possibly could ever need to be obedient to what I'm asking you to do. I'm giving you everything that you need to be able to take the next step of faith, which is another great reminder. You might want to write this one down too. Because when it comes to God, he simply asks you to bring what you have. He says, go in the strength that you have. God's not going to ask you to bring what I have, and he's not going to ask me to bring what you have. God doesn't ask Gideon to muster up something that wasn't there. He wasn't asking Gideon to pretend that he was something that he wasn't. He wasn't asking Gideon to be anything other than his true, fully, and authentic self. He said, just bring what you have. Now, Gideon clearly doesn't believe that's enough, and he says, pardon me, my Lord, verse 15. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family, which is so interesting to me, because have you ever noticed how everybody wants a calling until that calling calls? And the Lord answered, he said, Gideon, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. There's another powerful truth in this. You might want to write this down too. Because when it comes to God, it's about his power more than it is about your potential. When God calls you to do something, it's less about your strength. It's less about the things that you think you have and measuring those up with what's around you. It's more about his presence. I mean, I love the Lord's reply to Gideon. He says, Gideon, I know who you are. I'm the one who found you there. I see your situation. I'm well aware of the challenges. And truth be told, Gideon, it's not really about you. It's not really about you at all. It's about me. It's not about your abilities. It's about my promises. I'll be with you, Gideon. And Gideon, I'm enough. And honestly, even after all of this, as we read through the text, we see that Gideon still isn't very certain. He's had this encounter, and so he says, hey, can I bring an offering to you. And so he goes and he does that, and the offering is consumed by fire in this divine and miraculous way. And Gideon is so clear that it's God that he declares, alas, he says, the sovereign Lord, I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face, and it terrifies him. And so Gideon then goes out, he's like, man, this is God. And so he goes out and he's like, I've got to tear down the Asherah pole. I've got to tear down the altars to Baal. I got to do all this stuff. Like, we have fallen so far away from God. All that stuff needs to be torn down. Like right now. Well, not right now. Like, I'll wait till tonight when everyone's asleep. And he tears everything down. And the people wake up the next morning and they go, who tore all of our stuff down? And Gideon's like, and Gideon doesn't say a thing. You know who comes out and says something? His dad. His dad comes out and he's like, I mean, if those were like really gods, they would have been able to protect themselves. So why are you like worrying about them, you know? And all the people are like, I suppose so. And Gideon's like, thanks, Dad, you know? And it's not in the text, but I think it's there, right? And so Gideon does these things, doesn't really stick his neck out. And it's at this point, Gideon begins to think that maybe God is worth trusting. But rather than step out and trust, he decides to put God to the test. See in verse 36, it says, Gideon says to God, but if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor, and if there's any dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And this is what happened, verse 38. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. And Gideon's like, well, that was cool. So Gideon says to God, but don't be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more, what? Test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground around it be covered with dew. And that night God did so, only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. Now maybe on the surface, this sounds like a reasonable thing to do, maybe an okay thing to do, that we just like, oh, well, Gideon's just kind of having this interchange with God, but there's a problem. This was the very sort of thing that God told Israel not to do back in Deuteronomy chapter 6. He said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. All the Lord wants from Gideon is trust. And all Gideon does is just keep on testing. Now let me be clear. I don't think that having questions and doubts and all of those things is problematic in our faith. Having questions and doubts are part of the way that God brings us along and grow. If you have questions and you have doubts, when you lean into those things, that's part of what God will use to expand your faith, to increase your understanding, right? But do you know the number one way that God brings you through your questions and your doubts? Trust. It's one step, followed by another step, followed by another step, followed by another step. The number one way that God brings you through your questions and your doubts isn't through tests, it's through trust. And as we read this story, there's this penetrating question that we should begin to ask ourselves. Am I trusting God or am I testing God? And we see it over and again in the scriptures. God is always and ever asking and inviting his people to trust him. Through the psalmist, he declares this beautiful word. He says, taste and see that the Lord is good. It's this invitation to trust and to engage. But far too often, the people of Israel, but not just the people of Israel, us today, we say, taste and see, nah, show and prove to me that the Lord is good. I'll stay distant, thank you. I'll stay on the outside, thank you. Because God invites us to experience the thrill and the security of his presence. And we stand at distance with a skeptical gaze, asking, can you give me another sign? When a truck full of signs just pulled out in front of us. Friends, here's the thing. This is an axiom for my life. You do not have to understand God fully to trust him completely. Let's say it again. You don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Joshua and Jericho. And friends, I'm a Midwest pastor. I'm not a military strategist, but here's what I know about the strategy that God gave Joshua at Jericho. It was terrible. Except it wasn't, right? Why? Because it was God's strategy. It was God's plan. And what God showed Joshua is you don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. Some of you know that years ago, I stepped into vocational ministry from the marketplace, and I have this engineering background, and we made the decision to move into full-time ministry as a family. And we have more questions than we had answers. Sometimes we still have more questions than we have answers. But here's what I know. You don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. If the clarity that you have is that God is leading, then that's all the clarity that you actually need. And this theme shines through the rest of Gideon's story, not the rest, but the next portion of Gideon's story. So they're getting ready to go into battle with the Midianites, and there's 135,000 warriors from the Midianites, and Gideon's like, all right, let's wrestle up an army. He's got 32,000 men. And so they go off to battle, and we find it in Judges 7. It says, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. And the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. Yes, we read that correctly. What we know is that Gideon's army is outnumbered 4-1, and God's like, you have too many men. Remember the thing we said earlier? When it comes to God, it's not always about what you can see, right? And so what you see as insurmountable odds, God actually sees it an unfair fight. And so look at what he tells Gideon. He says, I can't deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left. 10,000 remained. I mean, can you imagine Gideon's disappointment? He's like, oh, okay, well, we got to get rid of like a few more, we got a few too many in our 32,000. So I'm gonna let people know if they can go and be free. And so I'm gonna send this message out to my strongest, bravest, most testosterone-filled, like Braveheart-loving guys. It's like a couple of guys will walk away, but the rest are with me. And they're like, whoo, great idea. And they leave. 2/3 leave. And so now Gideon, I think, is probably starting to figure out, how do I come, like I had sort of had a battle plan from when we were outnumbered 4-1, but now how do I come up with a battle plan now that we're outnumbered 13-1? And he hasn't even figured that out. And here's what God says. It says, but the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Now take them down to the water and I will thin them out for you there. And Gideon's like, oh, great. And if I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. And so Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. And 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs, and all the rest got down on their knees to drink. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. And so Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. See, God was gonna make sure that Gideon understood that when it comes to God, it's about his power more than your potential. And so with the odds standing now at 450-1, Gideon steps forward because he was learning you don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. And so he begins to step forward, and God proved once again that he's inviting us in trust to simply bring what we have to the table. And here's what happens in verse 16. It says, dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed the trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside, because every warrior needs an empty jar. It says, watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed guard. And they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. And grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, not a sword, of like a torch and a trumpet, they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. And when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So Gideon wins, the army of Israel wins. Why? Sorry. Not because of their military might, but because they stopped testing. They started trusting. In so many ways, this was a lot like Jericho, right? It was actually never supposed to be about the strength of Israel to clear the land. It was always meant to be about the trust of Israel to follow God and what he was doing. Friends, you don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. And then the story of Gideon ends with this cautionary tale. In the end, the people of Israel asked Gideon to rule over them as their king, to become their king, and he refuses to do that, which was a wise thing to do. God hadn't told him to be king. But then Gideon asked the people, he's like, I'm not gonna rule over you, but you can give me a present. You can give me like a little thank you gift, right? So he asked for like some precious metal there. And he takes all this together and he builds an idol. It's in the text, it's called an ephod, but it's an idol. And rather than worshiping God, who just delivered him and Israel and all those things, he begins to worship the gifts of God. He begins to worship this idol. In Judges 8, it says this. It says, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. And all Israel, harsh word that's coming up, all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping him there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Down to verse 33. It says, no sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal Berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. And what we see is Gideon had these encounters with God. He had seen the power of God on display in his life. But Gideon and the people of Israel, I'm not just trying to pick on Gideon, but they never learned the lesson. They never placed their trust in the Lord, not completely. And in the end, Israel ended up no better than before. Actually, what we see is that in the end, they actually cycle down to worse than they were before. What did Israel need? It needed a deliverer who would be faithful to God no matter what. Who even when Israel didn't understand him would go all the way in his obedience. The very thing we have in Jesus. Friends, I'm firmly convinced that one of the reasons that many of us don't experience the power and the presence of God in our lives is because when he asks us to take a step forward in faith, we keep ourselves planted in our seat. When he asks us to take a risk, we choose to play it safe. When he asks us to do something that would stir the pot, we opt for the same old, same old, same old. Because we're afraid, we're uncertain, we just don't know how it's all gonna play out. So many things that could go wrong. But you don't have to understand God fully to trust him completely. If God tells you to take a step of faith, if he tells you to take the next step of faith, but you go, okay, like I'm willing to take that step, but I just need to know what's step 2, what's step 3, what's step 4, what's step 5. If God asks you to take a step of faith, but you hesitate, instead waiting for greater clarity on what's the other side, and you go, hey, I'm just waiting on God to answer my questions, because I want to take step 1, but I just need a little clarity about God answers 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm just waiting on God. Can I give you a little secret? You're not waiting on God, God's waiting on you. If he's giving you the instructions to take a step of faith, but you're hesitating because you don't know what's at the other end of that step of faith, you're not waiting on God, God's waiting on you. God uses risks. He uses these steps of faith, and by definition, a step of faith means that there are some things you don't know in it. He uses these steps of faith to grow you, to deepen your faith, to stretch your faith. So he wants us to step forward in faith, even if we don't know what the second step will mean and where it will take us. The not knowing is what requires faith, friends. And the not knowing compels us to rely on God. The not knowing The not knowing is what flings wide the doorways to experience the ever-presence and almighty power of our God. It's not the knowing, it's the not knowing. So here's the personal question. I asked it earlier, but I'm gonna ask it in a different way. What have you been too scared to do? What is it that God's asking you to trust and you're just testing instead? What have you been too scared to do? What's the step of faith that God has asked you to take that you've been unwilling to take? And it's time to take a step, because here's the great promise. I don't know what's on the other side of that step of faith. I don't know all the challenges that are out there. I don't know what he's gonna ask you to do next. I don't know how all those things are gonna go. I don't know any of those things, friends, but you know what I know? On the other side of that step of faith, God is there. And with the assurance of his presence, what seems like a risk is no risk at all. With the assurance of his promises, what seems like you've made yourself vulnerable is actually stepping into the place of the greatest strength. What seems like, man, I don't know how these things are gonna happen. I don't know what could possibly go forward from here. It's actually the doorway to the flourishing that God has created you for. Why? Because he is there. And his promise is that his power will be made perfect where? In your strength and your knowing? Nah, that's not what the scriptures say. It says that his power will be made perfect in your weakness. So let's be people who say, God, I don't have to understand it fully. I don't have to understand what you're doing fully. I got so many questions and so many things that I don't understand. And why would you do it that way? And why would you do those things? And why would you do that thing? And why would you do this thing? And I have so many questions. You don't have to understand it fully to obey him completely. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you that on the other side of risk is your promise. On the other side of risk is your presence. God, we thank you that in faith, Lord, you meet us in these places and you provide for us in ways that we could never even begin to dream. So God, we hear your call as the call of Gideon, the go and the strength that you have. Friends, right now, I feel like there are some of us in the room, some of us who are listening online. There's a thing that God has been asking you to do, and it's felt risky, and you've known it's felt risky, and you've been hesitant. And if that's you, I just want you, just in the quiet of your heart, say, that's me. Lord, that's me. I'm hiding in the wine press over here. I don't want it to be destroyed. I've been working so hard, been trying so hard. Friend, would you actually turn to the Lord and say now, I don't understand, but I'll trust. God, thank you for the commitments of faith that are being made in this place even now. And we ask that you would empower us, that you would strengthen us. And God, would you just be faithful to your promise and go with us wherever we go. For our good, but ultimately, Lord, for your glory. In your name we pray. Amen.